carrying on and developing on some of those themes, I think, and taking it probably a little bit more broadly and widely, we've set up, I think, an interesting panel looking at the challenges facing public service broadcasting in these particularly interesting and changing times that we've been hearing about. This is going to be chaired by Professor Stephen Barnett. Steve is a long-term friend of the VLV, a long-term speaker at these conferences and elsewhere. He is, of course, Professor of Communications at the University of Westminster. He's also, incidentally, just been appointed as one of the advisors, as the advisor to the House of Commons Select Committee, looking at the BBC Charter issue. So he's also very much, I think, up to speed with all of these issues. Steve, I'm going to ask you to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks. I will. And because of that, I'm going to be less opinionated than usual. So I suspect my panelists will be very pleased about that. Right, I'm going to introduce the panelists. I've got Magnus, Brooke. You'll know all three of them, I'm sure. They've also been regular speakers here and on platforms over the years. Magnus has been a fixture at ITV for 20 years.
Nearly, yeah.
Now Group Director of Strategy, Policy and Regulation. Before then, all three of them, I have to say, have been immersed in the sort of political sphere, which is interesting. He ran the DG's office at the BBC under both Greg Dyke and Mark Thompson. During the last Charter Review, well, not the last but one.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes.
In 05-06. Magnus and I were both on the DCMS panel last year on the future of TV distribution, where we sort of agreed disagreeably.
It was very civilised.
A fair amount of the time. It was very civilised. Iain Bundred, who's sort of just arrived, more or less, we've been there a year now at the BBC, Director of Policy and Public Affairs, after 5 years as the head of public policy at YouTube, so now reunited with a former boss? Or?
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
Okay.
Not yet, on the 18th of May.
Yeah. Before that, he had a successful career in PR at Ogilvy and WPP, but before that worked in Downing Street as Gordon Brown's political spokesman. So also immersed in politics, though not then, I don't think, during Charter Review. And Claire, you'll all know as the doyenne of media analysis, founded Enders Analysis in 1997, so 30th birthday next year.
Indeed.
We'll look forward to the invitations. And has become the go-to for reliable analysis and forecasting in the creative industries. And I have to say, especially given some of the more outlandish forecasts and predictions about audience behaviour, Claire and her team bring some much-needed rigor to some of those crazy forecasts. I have to say that talking about politics, Claire was instrumental in getting the coalition government to intervene in the attempted takeover by News Corp of Sky in 2010, but that feels like a different era, doesn't it? I'm going to ask them to speak. They're going to each speak for 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to do it because I'm very conscious of the downside of having a name beginning with B, so I'm going to do it in reverse alphabetical order. So Claire, if you wouldn't mind going first, thanks.
So thank you very much. And also thank you, Colin, for asking me to support this event, which is something I love to do. And I think it's a really important event, and it's very much part of the voices that are heard in relation to very important media events, whether that's the privatization of Channel 4 or the future of the BBC. And I wish you a very long life. I know you put a huge amount of effort into it. So I'm just going to, we have 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to talk about my top concerns for public service broadcasting as a whole. The top one is the geopolitical situation and the emergence of this Trump trait of never is Trump going to relieve the blockade and the Strait of Hormuz is going to remain closed, which seems to be the going scenario. And the geopolitical impact of that and the impact on our economy, I don't need to tell you about. Chancellor Merz said it brilliantly anyway, which is this is costing the government, taxpayers, and human beings a great deal. And the continuation of that blockade is something that will cause a inevitably a period of stagflation at best, and at worst, a recession in the next year. And it could be quite severe. And that hits on a number of points that Jonathan Munro made, in particular, the one of evasion of the license fee. So I would say that my next big problem with what's going on is the explosion and normalization of theft of IP. And the BBC actually is not the worst victim of this. The Premier League is a significant victim of it, but the worst victims of it are pay platforms like Sky, who have systematically lost subscribers to illegal means. And I would say that cybersecurity is the biggest threat to our country and to the safety of all models that exploit IP, whether that is the BBC or indeed commercial broadcasters or the pay platforms. The importance of that cannot be underestimated. The number of devices, we're publishing a big report on this in advance of our conference. We think this is the biggest issue of the UK, is the proliferation of malware through home devices of every single kind and the normalization of theft. And there is no issue with the BBC that it can solve, that Sky isn't trying to solve as fast as it can, because the loss to Sky of over 1.5 million payers who are illegally watching, the levels of piracy, that's a romantic name. This is IP theft. Cybersecurity also affects, of course, the other element touched on by Jonathan Munro, which is basically the issue of credibility and trust. But actually, on that, I'm actually quite optimistic, because to the person from broadcast, I must say that in the world of AI, what's really been very striking is the growth of the authority and trust in 100-year-old brands, whether they are the BBC or the FT or the Guardian and so on. You see that the trust data is consistently showing, and I'm very glad to say this, my business is hitting 30, which only 4% of any enterprise ever started in the UK will achieve. The fact of the matter is that authority is what is keeping our subscription model going. And that authority of the BBC is rising, as is that of the FT, as is that of many, many high quality, and ITN, of course, all the news services provided by ITN have also risen in trust. So I'm very confident that somehow the news ecosystem that is regulated is delivering exactly what audiences want, and that makes me very, very happy indeed. I am absolutely terrified about what really happens when there are instant copies of almost everything you can think of that is IP protected. But the studios are pretty hot on the tail of that as well, because they themselves are very widely affected by IP theft.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to get them all to speak, and then no, you go, and then I will ask a couple of questions, and then.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Claire, and thanks everyone for coming. You've heard a lot from the BBC already today, so I don't want to talk specifically about the Charter Review. I wanted to think more about the importance of public service and the challenges, hence the title of it, around the wider public service ecosystem, which is I think everyone in this room would agree, is a very special, unique facet of the UK and the UK creative industries. Last year, the government introduced an industrial strategy, of which creative industries had its own plank. And I like to think of that over 100 years ago, we got ahead of the idea of what we now call industrial strategy by creating the BBC. And over various generations, whether it was the creation of ITV, whether it's the terms of trade, we've seen moments where successive governments have made a decision to intervene in this market to create something very, very special in the nature of the PSBs. I mean, coming from YouTube, as Steve mentioned, you see uniquely how powerful and how special it is to work at a place like the BBC, to work in a place that is driven by the public interest, not by commercial interest. And it gives us a particularly unique way, as Jonathan was talking about earlier, in terms of making decisions and being able to prioritise bit. But there's also a regulatory requirement that the entire PSB ecosystem has to put the public interest first. And so if we look at what that means for the BBC, we heard a lot about independent news. We talk about three roles we have. So trusted information, but also to back the best of British storytelling. So important to think about that, the role in playing back the UK, the stories about the UK and telling our stories. And in bringing the country together, we have a unique role as PSBs in those shared national moments. And I think that's really, ITV and ourselves are going to have an amazing summer because of the World Cup. What a great time when the whole country comes together. It's something that's unique to our system. But the sad news is that this very special ecosystem is really at risk. It's fundamentally, we're reaching a crossroads where without intervention, we will see British storytelling be at risk and jobs and the production sector be at risk. So right now, we need to think not just about what the BBC Charter Review means or what the next steps in certain individual regulators mean, but how are we going to get young people of the future to build sustainable careers in this sector? How are we going to protect the storytelling and the lives and the playing back to the UK that PSBs exist unless we have intervention? So we'll come to the panel, I'm sure, and talk about lots of things. But last year at the Royal Television Society conference, the PSBs came together and talked about 5 key interventions that we felt we needed. And I wanted to just touch briefly on a couple of them. The first is around how we show up on major platforms, so a new prominence regime. The Media Act addressed some of it, but video sharing platforms in particular are not covered. I think it's critical we see intervention to make it so that news and other PSB remit content is discoverable, so that young audiences in particular, but all audiences using these platforms will find PSB content. A second is about how we can unpick a better partnership to work together. In our Charter Review, Green Paper response, we suggested, for example, being allowed to have more PSB content on iPlayer and on Sound. So, an interesting idea that I think some will work for, some won't. Key thing there is about the fact that it should be a conscious decision we're able to make, not blocked by regulatory regime that was set for a previous age. Whatever happens though, and there was other things in that bit around tax credits and other issues. Whatever happens though, I think we need a moment of intervention, and we need to think back and try and energise ourselves in the same way that previous governments and societal moments have come together to intervene. And perhaps the Charter Review can be part of that. Perhaps we can see the Charter Review not in itself of a 10-year renewal for the BBC and what our particular mandate looks like, but a moment that the country comes together and starts to address for what audiences need in this modern world. And so I think as we come together today, I'd really encourage you all to think about that. Not just the peril, not just the risk, the challenges that the public service ecosystem face, but actually the opportunity that this moment, this government has if they'll grasp it. And I'd love to talk about it further.
Great, thanks, Iain. And Magnus.
Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear here again. So, look, there's very obviously a revolution going on in media globally. In the UK is actually in the vanguard of that, and what was overwhelmingly a set of national markets is becoming profoundly disrupted by globalisation and the ubiquity of internet distribution. And the changes in viewer and consumer behaviour are incredible. So nearly 90% of households have a connected internet-enabled primary television set now. 95% of households pay for broadband, and every home with a telephone line currently coming into it will have a modem and an internet connection by the beginning of next year. 70% of households are SVOD subscribers, so pay-on-demand subscribers. YouTube is rapidly becoming big screen TV for a lot of people in the living room, and that's not just about young people. So if you look at the numbers, the amount of YouTube watched on a television set last year by over 55s doubled. And YouTube in-home viewing on Barb numbers is more than ITV now, and it's nipping at the heels of the BBC. These are profound changes. And there are, of course, a set of global online distribution platforms emerging and a set of global TV content services. And just to give you a sense of their scale, so Netflix has about 325 million global subscribers. Disney spends about $24 billion, or will this year, $24 billion on content. Netflix around $20 billion, and they will spend about $2 billion on tech. The UK PSBs combined spend about $4 billion on content. And these players aren't just competing for subscriptions and viewing, they're now competing, all of them, for advertising with ITV and with all of the other commercial PSBs. So national PSB is under pressure, as you said, Iain, and not just in the UK, but across Europe. And as Ofcom found in its PSB review conclusions, PSB revenues from the licence fee and linear television advertising have declined more than a quarter in real terms since 2016. And BVOD revenues from ITVX and so on have not compensated for that. And Ofcom was very stark about the need for radical solutions in their PSB review. Starker than I've ever seen them put it before. They said, time is running out to save this pillar of UK culture and way of life. And the policy problem in the UK used to be lack of competition to monopoly PSB, and most interventions in the past 30 years have been about creating new competition. There's no lack of competition now. The problem is about sustaining national PSB. And the signs of pressure are very easy to see from the proposed savings and job losses at the BBC, but also at a smaller scale, the loss that STV recorded in Scotland last year and the changes it's having to make to its nation's news service. So what might radical thinking look like? Well, it's going to mean making difficult decisions and trade-offs and being ambitious. So, for instance, there should be a national effort over the next few years to ensure that everyone gets the benefit of IPTV and the internet more broadly. The online players offered by the PSBs open up vast libraries of content to watch whenever you want. It's a world away from just a few linear channels. But we also need to be realistic about how long the PSBs can continue to underwrite DTT. The BBC has made very clear that continuing to fund DTT or Freeview in the medium to longer term will come at the expense of funding programmes that we all watch, and we are in the same position. So secondly, we'll have to see more collaboration between the PSBs and between the PSBs and other players. We have to try to share costs to try to replicate some of the scale of our US competitors. This isn't defeatism. This could make PSB better for audiences if we can do this, because we will just spend less on the plumbing. There are a variety of flavours of this up to and including mergers, and in that context I'm sure you're all aware of our discussions with Sky on a possible combination. It's going to require a muscular approach to regulating online intermediaries and platforms to make sure the PSBs have a really meaningful prominence and we don't have to pay tolls to the new online gatekeepers. And that includes YouTube, which is explicitly selling itself as the new home of television. The Media Act will certainly do some of it if Ofcom is muscular in intervention, but the government will need to build on this and go further, particularly as YouTube becomes a destination for TV. And finally, we would support a BBC that's appropriately funded from public resources, albeit that the BBC must continue to have incentives to efficiency to ensure value for money. But we need to take care if we change the public funding mechanic to ensure that it doesn't distort competition by, for example, requiring the payment of a licence fee for use of some, but not other services in the market. Of course, you'd expect me to say this, but funding the BBC in whole or part from advertising on its public services wouldn't just undermine commercial PSB, but it will undermine the BBC itself by radically changing its incentives. It's such a bad idea that it ought to be ruled out now. And finally, let me just finish with an advert, of course, from ITV, for a programme coming up later this year on ITV, so 70 Up. This is the profoundly important series tracing the lives of a set of British people since they were 7. They're 70 now, and this means this may be the last time we can make this programme. We're delighted that the renowned documentary maker Asif Kapadia will direct the programme following the death of Michael Apted, who originated it. It's coming later this year, but all the previous series are streaming on ITVX now, so you can follow the lives up to 63 that we've all been following for so many years. Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to hear that. I remember the original. I mean, some of it dates me, and I suspect some of the people in this room, but 7 Up was one of the iconic programmes. It was Granada, wasn't it?
Yes.
And it was it was how Michael Apted, I think, started his career. A very illustrious career. So it'll be fascinating to see what's happened to them now. Right, I'm going to ask each of you one question, then I'm going to throw it open. So please think about what you want to ask. There were lots of questions in the last session. I'm sure we can take some of them forward in this one. Claire, I was really interested in what you were saying about trust and authority, because certainly some of the data that is pushed by some of our press, who are not entirely pro-BBC, have suggested the opposite, that trust in the BBC is declining rather than increasing. I said at the beginning that your data is always highly regarded, not least because it often counters the sort of conventional wisdoms. Can you just say a bit more about that? And you talked about the FT as well. Are we talking about an increase in comparison to some of the less trusted news outlets? Absolutely.
But you're actually staring at the specialist in data, my former professor at LBS. And so any mistakes we make, they're all his fault. That's what I'm going to say very quickly. Yes, the BBC has been very carefully measuring trust, and we ourselves gather a lot of data together and do make our best cast at it. And I think it's pretty robust, taken as a series, and it does show, I mean, there is an underlying basis for it, which is that we are trying to compare subscription trends and evasion trends, and there's no question that when you're looking at the level of trust that the BBC and the FT have together in our data, it's really very high. And it's not surprising. There are 3.2 million people in the world paying for the FT, and substantial sums. That bifurcation has not been affected remotely by AI. On the contrary, AI is driving subscription where those options exist. And frankly, there's a lack of price resistance across the board to highly trusted institutions. Now, unfortunately, at the bottom end of the trust in news is GB News. And that, again, is not surprising at all. We live in a complex ecosystem where there is a large part of opinion, and that opinion matters, and people are expressing it right, left, and center. The worry I've had more than anything has been the influencers, and how the influencers have huge groups of adherents, and their impact on what Jonathan Munro rightly referred to, and I say this as a Scottish resident, a completely fragmented environment where, thank the Lord, people define in a different way than Conservative and Labour. So I think that maintaining the value of what people trust in that environment has been a remarkable achievement of the UK media ecosystem as a whole. And yes, it may well be anchored by the impartiality, because the BBC, the FT, and ITN, all the three news services, come tops in trust. And that strikes me as something that is about editorial culture that is very well understood by consumers as a whole. And also, I must commend the BBC for the depth of resource that they put into research, because precisely to your point, our friends in the press, bless them, usually poll about 1,000 people and then call it a day, and usually online polling. So they're completely false. And I refer you to Sir John Curtis, who's also a data genius, and on top of Paddy's enormous expertise in this area. But there's no question that the AI age and the age of slop and 20 years of YouTube has caused people to understand the real bifurcations between all of these edited and curated environments, which they do trust, which they do consume in all of their forms. ITN News is consumed, Sky News, etc. Sky is not a PSB itself, but it operates under very similar rules and regs, because otherwise no one would trust it. So it also has a very strong trust rating because of its policies, which seem to get across. Impartiality may be impossible to explain to people, but somehow it's a culture that universally exists in the regulated newsrooms. And Sky.
There might be one or two questions on impartiality and whether it is currently being properly regulated, but I will leave that to members of the audience. Iain, You talked about the need for prominence on video sharing platforms. You came from YouTube, whose, I think, their global head of policy was over here last week, and I think was sort of making noises about how this was absolutely not necessary and we should run a million miles away from that. What would you now say to your former employer about why they should give up opposing prominence on YouTube?
Well, I've talked to my former employer quite regularly, but on this issue in particular, because I think there's a fundamental philosophical point here, actually, isn't there? Which is, YouTube is an open platform, and it makes a great virtue of the fact that every voice is equal, that the audience is able to find it. And I think if you're looking at it from a US lens, trying to even explain the PSB ecosystem, maybe they know BBC and they're familiar with ITV, but STV, S4C, MG Alba, trying to explain these very specific, particular and special institutions and how we got here, as it were, and why there is a regulatory framework in the UK that gives them special privileges in order to protect what we think is special, what we think is important, is difficult. And so there's a point here about how that they have to recognise that we are able to drive important things that is good for the UK ecosystem. I would say they've always said very consistently, and I used to say when I was there, that PSBs are very important to their viewers, that they like PSB content. They think PSB content tends to do quite well when it's sort of done in a YouTube first way. But ultimately, it's not really about what myself or Magnus or other sort of PSBs say to YouTube. It's about what the government will do. And Lisa and Andy has said explicitly that if we don't find a voluntary way to ensure that PSB content is discoverable on video sharing platforms, then she will regulate. And I think that may well be necessary if we can't get them to move.
Just one of their arguments, just to push back slightly, and I take your point about the sort of philosophical difference, is that YouTube helps to democratize. It allows a platform for young creators to get out there and reach people without having to go through the sort of commissioned gatekeepers of the PSBs.
Yeah, and I think there's actually a little bit that Claire was talking about in terms of sort of influencers or creators, content creators. There's an amazing ecosystem now, a fantastic. I mean, I've met a lot of these generally young, entrepreneurial, fantastic storytellers. A new way of getting into the media industry, and I think it's really exciting. In fact, Alex, you chaired a session yesterday where there was a great guy who'd actually been on Strictly, funny enough, but has made a business and is doing some amazing things. And they are different, but they're not regulated in the same way that the PSBs are. The content is not incentivised in the same way that we are to play back British stories, to explain what's going on. So I think we are just different. And I totally understand, as I just said, that philosophical difference between, but we're a democratic platform where the audience is deciding what's right, and the UK ecosystem, which says, well, there's certain companies that we think, with their public service remit, need to be found, need to be more prominent, need to be better to discover. And I think that is the thing we have to crack. But ultimately, it comes down to, as I said, this is all about, do we want to intervene? Is now the time that the UK says, no, we actually need to do something to correct this? Or do we address some of the points that Magnus talked about in his speech about, does this changing landscape become forever gone? Because without an intervention now, without that muscular approach that Magnus talked about, I think we'll lose something quite special.
Well, that actually follows on very nicely the question I wanted to ask Magnus, which is specifically about the muscular intervention that you're looking for, because you specifically talked about Ofcom.
Yep.
Are you confident the way in which Ofcom has been run, the decisions over its last few years, that it is still capable of that kind of muscular intervention? And what would it look like if they were?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, so Ofcom are currently consulting on the implementation of the really critical bits of the Media Act. Actually, so far, I think they've done a good job, actually, in terms of interpreting the wishes of Parliament. And in the end, what Ofcom would say is, look, Parliament needs to give us clear marching instructions, and we will march according to whatever those instructions are. we think in relation to prominence and dispute resolution, because the other bit of this for us is not having to pay the platforms, because we haven't got the money to pay the platforms and also pay for PSB, and that's been a cardinal principle for a very, very long time. So look, we'll see, because we've all made our submissions to the Ofcom consultation. Actually, what they published to start with was a good start, but there's quite a lot of stuff they have to do to get it into the right place. And let's hope they do. And I wouldn't want to prejudge positively or negatively, but this is the big test. I mean, this last consultation, which is the most difficult, which will effectively set the terms of agreement, if you like, between the PSBs and the platforms, subject to adjudication by Ofcom, will be the thing that determines whether we have some success or not. But look, the other thing is that you need to keep going at this. So as you say, Iain, YouTube isn't subject at the moment to this regime, but nor are things like gaming platforms, and an awful lot of younger people's consumption of TV comes through gaming. So one of the things we're going to need to keep on doing is worrying away at how are people getting television, and just on the YouTube point. I mean, YouTube itself is setting itself up as a television platform. Yes, there are fantastic creators on there, and that's terrific, and it is a kind of open access platform. That's great, but actually one of the growth areas they've identified is television, professional television, with a view to trying to compete even more actively for brand advertising, which is what we do. And actually what the government said in relation to all the other platforms that are setting themselves up in the same way, you have a responsibility to help ensure that PSB is sustainable. And that's really all we ask.
On that point, were you really satisfied with the Ofcom consultation, which talked about giving PSBs no less prominence than non-PSBs? That struck me as being absolutely the opposite of what Parliament suggested.
Well, so I mean, look, this is the area for discussion, isn't it?
You said you were happy with their consultation.
No, I didn't say that, and we're definitely not happy with aspects of their consultation. As in a sense, that's not totally surprising. Look, the big challenge Ofcom have is trying to. As it were, they get their instructions from Parliament, they then have groups of stakeholders, and what we would say to Ofcom is you need to make an active choice now between those groups of stakeholders. What you can't do is try and keep everybody happy, because we've got to the point now where actually you need to make some choices. And the critical choice you need to make is whether you're going to say, actually PSB, as you have said in your own PSB review, is threatened. And the only logical way forward from that, given the things you do control, and Ofcom doesn't control everything, but the only logical place to go is to say, okay, we're going in our statement on the consultation, we are going to have muscular intervention in favour of PSB. That is the right priority now. All of these other global players are going to be fine. Google is going to be fine. Samsung is going to be fine. We've already said, as Ofcom, PSB might not be.
Okay, it's a very interesting message, I think, to the new chair of Ofcom, that it is time for you have to make active decisions now.
Yeah,
And it's their own decision.
It's also going to be very important for Matt to take that argument forward, because it is the key argument, and I think we all agree that it has to be achieved, particularly on YouTube, but all the other platforms as well. Because that is the nature of prominence, and as you say, the other platforms are also very significant. But may I just make the point that our data on YouTube shows the absence of public service broadcasting in the news mix across demographics. There is a very strong presence of American news and of Farage. He's not young. He has got more followers than a lot of other people put together. So what I'm saying is that actually YouTube is over-presenting Fox News, over-presenting Joe Rogan, over-presenting Nigel Farage, and actually the share of PSB news consumption on YouTube is pitiful. And so yes, we need prominence, and people need to find it, and it cannot be the same as what's coming from Joe Rogan and Nigel Farage. No,
Okay,
it cannot.
Iain, do you want to add
Yeah, I'm
something?
just going to come back on that. I mean, Press Gazette said something yesterday about how World Service is the fastest growing news brand on YouTube at the moment, which was great to read. I think we've made a conscious decision to increase the amount of content, because we think the audience need is there, and that we have to supply more news content on YouTube. I would say though, we're we have a huge subscriber base there already. BBC News is, I think, second or third most subscribed news channel globally. And we do get some very good, you get some enormous news moments because, as Jonathan said at the start of this conference, it's been a very busy time and people come, because we are trusted both domestically but globally, people really come to the BBC for news. So it's important that we're there, but to the point we're making it, it's also important that people who are there can discover us, can find us. So Claire raises a really important issue for us all, which is, do you get crowded out by more polarised and less independent and balanced news? And I think we need that intervention.
Which comes back to the algorithm, which was raised in the last session. Right, your turn. Oh, God, right, a lot of questions. Okay, as usual, please just say who you are, and if it's for one of the specific members of the panel, please say who. I'm going to take 3 questions, ideally first from those who haven't spoken before. I can't see people's faces, so I'm sure I know people, but I'm not going to say names. Right, one at the back, a young lady, I think it's Helen actually, in the green, and then there's a young man there, and then in front of him. Let's take those 3. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Hi, everyone. Helen J, University of Westminster. I wanted to pick up on the excellent question, actually, about the distinctiveness in the attention economy that was asked in the previous panel. Do you think, should public service media be distinctive in its relation to the underlying technology that it uses, whether that's algorithms or AI or whatever else, or is it sufficient to be distinctive in the content itself?
Okay, I think that's a huge question. Right, yes. I'm going to throw that to everyone, I think.
Thanks. Hello, Jack Gamble from the Campaign for the Arts. I think it's clear from the Culture Secretary's public statements and recently from the BBC Charter Review Green Paper that the UK government, this UK government, agrees with the panel, and I'm sure everyone in this room, that public service media is really valuable and really important. But I think you'd be hard pushed to accuse the government of pursuing the radical solutions to sustain national PSB that Ofcom has identified. And I think it's striking when you look at the Green Paper for BBC Charter Review that Magnus, the idea of advertising on the BBC, which you just described as such a bad idea, it ought to be ruled out now, is one of the few meaningful changes that the government has ruled in the Green Paper, notably leaving out things like a household levy or funding the BBC from general taxation. So my question for the panel is, why do you think the government so far has shown a relative lack of boldness and imagination and radicalism over PSB, and what could those of us who want to see more of it do to get more of it from this government?
Great, and the young man in front of you.
Delighted to be called a young man. Khalid Hayat, I'm independent, but I've most recently worked at Channel 4. It's a question for everyone on the panel, which is really about consolidation in our sector. And Claire, your colleagues at Enders Analysis very recently put out a great report talking about the need for consolidation amongst broadcasters. Magnus, you alluded to it in your remarks. I know you can't talk about conversations that may or may not be happening with Sky, but do we think the UK market can sustain the number of PSBs we have? And in particular, do we think the commercial part of the PSB ecosystem can sustain all of ITV, Channel 4 and Channel 5?
I think that's a great question to start with, because it's been raised a few times. Magnus, exactly as you say, you can't talk about what's happening with Sky, but there is increasing concern as to whether we can continue to sustain 3 commercial public service channels, given the scale of the US intervention, the investment in content that you were talking about, Netflix, etc. How's it looking? I mean, 5 years from now, are we still going to have 3 commercial PSBs?
So look, I mean, one thing I can say is we are talking to Sky. That's a matter of public record. And the backdrop to some of those conversations is some of the things I talked about. I think you need to take each commercial PSB one by one. So I think if you take Channel 5, there's obviously a very big transaction going on globally with Channel 5 at the moment, in the merger with WBD, and that's going to create a slightly different thing, which has even more scale. Channel 4 is owned by the state, So the state has decisions to take about what it wants from public service broadcasting and from Channel 4. And Channel 4 has a new chief executive who's doing a review of what Channel 4 exists to do. As it happens, I think there is a sustainable model for Channel 4, potentially. But that's a matter for Channel 4 and the government to decide, not necessarily the market. The market isn't going to ultimately decide what happens to Channel 4, because in the end the government will have to decide. And then ITV, we're having the conversation. So, in a sense, I've set out what I think are the challenges to national players in a market which is increasingly dominated by global players. And I think government recognises that with something like the Media Act, which, by the way, is, government doesn't get everything right, and maybe it could be more radical and faster to move and so on. But actually, the Media Act is world-leading. There aren't many countries, actually, who've been quicker than the UK to get to a comprehensive defence of PSB against global platforms who are taking tolls, not making content prominent. And the number of conversations I have with continental broadcasters and others elsewhere in the world, really desperate for their own governments, for the European Commission and so on, to do similar sorts of things, is quite considerable. Now, of course, we'd rather it happened 5 years before it did, but there are explanations around that, around COVID in particular, which was a huge distraction for the state, which have caused this to be on a slower timetable than ideally we would like.
Yeah, I get that point about Media Act.
I actually also just want to highlight something really important, which is that all of the PSBs have been written off repeatedly throughout my very long career in media, and they have always changed. And Jonathan was talking about a huge cost-cutting program at the BBC. I'm sure that we will see the same elsewhere in the commercial PSBs, and also radical changes in strategies. For instance, much more acquisitions now that the studios are throwing their material at the public service broadcasters, and in particular that will be very supportive of Channel 5. The changes that could be made at Channel 4 really involve getting rid of the building, and obviously in making the cost changes which are necessary, because unfortunately what's happened with the strategy in the nations and regions is that it has simply added to the cost of Channel 4 without adding to the income. And that's also true of the YouTube strategy of Channel 4, which is loss-making. That happens to be probably the case with the ITV strategy as well on YouTube. So loss-making YouTube strategies are a key concern of mine, because studios have had loss-making YouTube strategies for now 15 years, some almost 20. So if, yes, loss-making YouTube strategies are a key feature of the future in a major recession, which always tends to be hyper-cyclical. I mean, we didn't ask for this condition of the world, but the changes that will come will be fewer productions made, and that's fine.
Iain, I'm going to come to you for Helen's question, which is huge, and I think it's...
I was hoping to go for the first two.
What?
I was hoping to go the other two so I could avoid Helen's question, but no.
Well,
let me, if I can. Can I just maybe just touch on the first two and then go on?
Yeah, of course.
So on the two we just did, because I think, to Jack's point, lack of boldness, I agree with Magnus. We shouldn't underestimate some of the things that they have done, and how the UK remains leading. And like just yesterday, Liz Kendall did this thing on AI sovereignty, which looked very interesting. I need to look at it further. I think there is an opportunity to be bold, and I think now is the time that the government is warming up to that. They haven't necessarily pulled any levers, but even on, for example, advertising, yes, it wasn't ruled in. It was consulted on. It was some option that was on the table. I agree with that, but let's judge them by the final charter review in that respect, and also some of these other changes that may need to be done. To Khaled's point, I think the Ofcom and the government both would see a sustainable future for PSBs, but see that the work needs to be done, and I think there will be in 5 years' time. All three would be my prediction, but let's see how it goes. I think to the point that Helen makes, there's a really interesting challenge of how do we keep the British ecosystem unique and differentiated. I'm not convinced that's about creating our rival technologies or that kind of stuff. Ultimately, competing with hyperscalers, we don't have the revenue do it. But it's not to say that we shouldn't consider what bits we do want to protect. And that's why I raised the AI sovereignty point. You know, there's some really interesting questions and debates about where the BBC in particular, but the wider PSB ecosystem can make intervention and can support the wider creative economy. You mentioned across the UK, those are conscious policy decisions. We put in our Green Paper response a really bold ambition to drive even further power and decision-making of BBC leaders and commissioners outside of London. That isn't necessarily the most efficient way to divide resources, but it's a conscious choice. And I think if we get a sustainable funding settlement, we can do that because it's right for Britain, because it's the good thing that we need. And I think those decisions are driven by that public interest and by the different regulatory framework we've got. So almost going back to Jack's original point, if we are bold now, we can make some of these decisions, and we can do that jointly, but we do need to do that now.
Claire, Magnus, do you want to say anything in particular about the lack of ambition, Jack's point, in the Green Paper? Agree, disagree?
In the Green Paper?
The Green Paper, yeah.
Well, not particularly.
You don't want to say
I think that all
we
the
need
points have
people who are
been
going to be
touched
robust
on.
in their views. Sorry, Claire, go on.
We're also living in all the PSBs, in all of the many in the EBU are living under the very watchful eyes of Trump and his many supporters everywhere, and that atmosphere of fear is something no one has touched on.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that we are not only facing a very, very frightened young population that is out of work permanently, it seems, but we're also facing a very, very frightening Trump action on the UK and any attempt at enforcement of any piece of legislation that has been passed, online harms in particular. So, you know, the delicacy and diplomacy that is required of Ofcom and the government should not be underestimated.
I completely accept that, but you could argue that that is absolutely a reason for pushing back, that now is the time to say that's far and no further. But anyway, that's a completely different debate. Right, yes, we have one here, the young lady who I recognise in the green at the back, Vanessa, and a gentleman here in front. Yeah.
Hello, Phil Harding. I'm a journalist. We've heard a lot of fine words from the government about the BBC and how important and how valuable the BBC is. We've also heard this morning that the system of funding the BBC is broke and that the BBC has no money because they're going to have to make a wide raft of cuts. This is a government that is noted probably mostly for its timidity. How confident are you that the government is willing to really grasp the nettle of both the method of funding the BBC and the amount by which the BBC is funded?
Right. I'd be interested to hear Iain's answer to this.
Well, I could give
hang
us
on. We're going to take two more questions first. Vanessa, yeah.
Yeah, this is a question, well, for all of you, but it was something that was mentioned by you, Claire. So talking about impartiality, well, all UK broadcasters are bound by impartiality, obviously, but obviously it's interpreted differently by each of the broadcasters and also, I would suggest, by the regulators implementing it. So it's a question to the panel really about, one, whether or not that means that those impartiality regulations are still important, whether they're now effectively meaningless, and secondly, whether PSB can actually differentiate themselves by having stronger impartiality regulations, either that they put upon themselves or that a regulator does.
Okay, wait. And then we've got one more. Yes, the gentleman here.
Thanks very much. Jeremy Harbour, just a viewer and a listener. I'd like to pick up Iain's point on authority. For example, I went to look up the King's speech to Congress on the BBC, natural place to go and find the full speech, a 5-minute edited highlight, that was all. You're missing a trick. I'd like to give a big shout out to Roger Bolton's Beeb Watch, which is terrific, who's highlighted how the BBC has withdrawn, obviously, from religion, science. Where is Joshua Rosenberg, I would say, about law, and in particular history. And I think that the way for you to provide authority, although it's a no-cost point for you, is to get those academic historians to provide the sort of information that we need for a counter-narrative to a lot of things that are going on at the moment. People will look naturally to the BBC and all public service broadcaster for that sort of information, rather than having to go on YouTube, and I think you're missing an opportunity there. For example, I think you've been dazzled by Gaza and Trump last year, and I know History Reclaimed are coming to see the BBC. They came 3 months ago, I think, to see, and you're doing something about it. What progress are you making about improving that academic and age diversity to bring in those academic historians back to the BBC's situation of about 10, 15 years before, when that happened all the time? You used to bring in academics to help you. Sorry, I panned on.
Yeah, no, we definitely need more work for academics. Absolutely support that. Let's put Phil's question first. Claire, I know you were dying to get in.
Yes, I was just going to say that it is not true that all broadcasters in the UK are regulated in the same way. The PSBs are regulated in a very specific way, and that.
But in terms of impartiality, as Vanessa's point,
yes,
they are.
They are, and that is a mysterious thing. That is the envy of the world. I've been asked by the Czech Parliament, and we've been asked by the French authorities, how can you have this mysterious being within you that makes you guys so special and exportable? Because obviously, it is something that is a culture, and it is the hardest thing to explain, but I say it is codified, and I do think it is the secret sauce, and I do think it is a cultural thing in every single one of the newsrooms, and that's why it perpetuates. And it is the fundamental part of the charter that I would defend to my last breath.
But would you say that it is still appropriate to oblige every single licensed broadcaster, which is the law, to follow those impartiality requirements? And is that what underpins the trust and authority that you've been talking about?
Absolutely. And all you have to do is look at what happened in Hungary when the equivalent of the BBC was immediately taken under the direct control of the government in regard to funding and operations, and became a propaganda tool. Obviously, impartiality was not part of its original remit, but the distortions that can operate on public service broadcasters that are hijacked by prime ministers is a very well understood theme in Italy, and the decay of democracy in Italy or in Hungary is very, very hard to reverse.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm going to, because I want to get more questions in. Magnus, do you want to say anything?
Well, only that we're completely committed to impartiality as ITV News, and ITN is too. It is at the heart of everything we want in terms of the trust that we need for our news. So we've got no desire to push that back in as ITV. But frankly, I'd agree with Claire that we would support the regime as a whole, because I just think the worked examples of countries that don't have equivalent rules is terrifying.
Interesting. Okay.
I'd also just make an observation. There's a real growth in podcasting where you have this sort of faux equivalence, and it feels like it comes across like a radio in an impartial sense, but actually it's two people fundamentally agreeing with each other, and it isn't necessarily being fact-checked and having the same level. Claire mentioned AI slop and some of the ways that trusted news is being more valued. I think over time, as audiences become more aware of those risks, I'm optimistic that actually the impartiality is a real sort of secret source for us to do it. Certainly globally, you definitely see that's what I mentioned, the great viewership stats for BBC News worldwide. Part of that is because they know that they can trust us. So I think it's important. I think it's really critical that it continues to be regulated appropriately.
It's a mystery. It is a mystery.
So
but it's secret.
Phil's question.
Yeah, so Phil, I think Phil's and Johnny's question.
Is the government going to grasp the nettle?
Well, we'll see, won't we? I mean, we don't know. There's still some time. Still some time. We've got. We don't expire.
You wouldn't expect any other.
No. Well, no. I think it goes back to my point around intervention, right? Our charter expires on the 31st of December 2027, so we've got a bit of time to be sure. I would say that we have to be really clear what we want. And I also think you mentioned the sort of what we've heard already. The truth is we cannot deliver on our current missions and public purpose with the funding model as it is. You mentioned quantum, the actual quantum, but also the mechanic. We do need fundamental change. Otherwise, we lead to managed decline. Actually, The question that was made about history reclaimed and some of the challenges about how we're delivering our current remit, we have met with those academics. I think there is an ongoing discussion. I won't go into where we go on that, but I think it's definitely a fair challenge. But the truth is that's because we are dealing with 15 years of declining revenue, a license fee model that isn't able to deliver what it was. And so we have to make tough choices, and we have to make choices that encourage more license fee payers. You end up in this, to remain universal, to remain genuinely full, not just for some, we do need intervention. So will they grasp the nettle? Well, we'll find out.
Claire, you're the only one who doesn't have to be diplomatic about this. Will the government grasp the nettle?
I'm afraid that I don't. I think the Treasury is so used to resisting the BBC and Channel 4 in regard to access to their facilities and making life difficult, correctly, for those organizations that we're going to continue to see. I mean, the opportunity to get increased facilities or better access to the facilities that Channel 4 and the BBC have was under the previous government, not this one, which is much more indebted. So that's a failure of strategy of the previous chief executives of those organizations to not understand that time was running out and Jeremy Hunt's door was open to increasing the facilities of both the organizations. They do not have access to those facilities. I'm very worried. That's nothing to do with Trump. That's something to do with the Treasury and the fact that we're very indebted. That is also true of every PSB in Europe is facing similar conditions, similar rates of evasion. Absolutely. This is a cost of living issue. Everybody loves the BBC and uses it 94 times a week. I mean, we all know that. But the fact is that you can't find, to your point, there is nothing the government can do to enforce the rise in the level of invasion because it's caused by its own policies, like child benefit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very conscious that you're absolutely right.
Sorry.
The geopolitical cost of living context is going to make it difficult. Right, I think we've got room for a couple more questions. There's a gentleman at the back. There's a young lady here, and a gentleman. I'm going to have to. Well, all right. But if they're quick, right? Let's have those three. Sorry, where are we starting? At the back? Yeah.
We're not tied for time.
We're not tied for time. I'm conscious I haven't really been looking over here. So yes, there's a question here as well. Let's go from there to there, and then we'll go back to there. Yes.
Thanks, Steve. Tim Wilson, media policy consultant. I can't help feeling, and I can't evidence this, but despite the very good reasons that Iain and others have given this morning as to why the licence fee payment has declined, there is another aspect to it, which is the concentrated and long-term campaign to undermine BBC licence fee payment by certain sections of the media, of politics and society. And so how important is it to make sure that whatever the new model looks like, it isn't such an outlier in terms of where the money comes from, that people can actually be sort of persuaded not to pay it for reasons which frankly are not to do with undermining, as far as I'm concerned, objective and impartial news and democracy.
Yeah. Right, question here, if we could. I think the microphone's just, it's arriving.
Thank you. Candice Veal, just a license fee payer. Just following on from the evasion questions, I had over the past year conversations with students outside of a London university and I have a niece at Leeds University. At Leeds University, she said no one in her housing paid a license fee. And I said, well, how is that? And does the university pay for it? And she says, I had no idea, but of course they all accessed BBC. The students outside of the London University, all of the students I have spoken to over the years have said they really appreciate the BBC. They would be so sorry to see it not funded, but they have no idea whether they're paying it or not.
Okay.
And so that's the point. But also, I just want to add a tangent, if I may, quickly, and that is the question of the phones for children. And this adds up because the conditions by which young people start looking for information starts with their phones at school. And they can be got rid of the smartphones at school, and they can just be given watches to access particular phone numbers.
Okay, I'm going to stop you. Yeah, thank you very much. I really want short questions, please. There was a gentleman there, and there's a young lady here.
Leo Watkins, VLV, and also Goldsmiths. So The question is about social exemptions from the licence fee, because the last government looked at the question of decriminalising non-payment of the licence fee, which is quite a bad idea, because just because people can't afford a tax doesn't mean that decriminalising it will help them. It just replaces it with bailiffs and so forth. So that was a non-starter, but there is still a problem that there are over 100,000 people, I think, who get prosecuted each year for evasion, and in some cases it's genuine evasion, and in some cases it's people who are too poor to pay the licence fee. Other countries that have moved to household broadcasting levies have social exemptions for particular categories of people. If the government were to reform the licence fee model and bring in people who, for example, access BBC online, it will also be bringing in more people who can't afford to pay because they're simply too poor. So the question is, what kind of social exemptions, if any, should there be at the same time as the problem of evasion is tackled and the remit of who pays the licence fee is expanded?
Yep, okay. And this lady here and the gentleman behind you, and I think we'll draw a line after that.
Thank you. So I'm Celeste from the University of Leeds. I just wanted to draw the topic kind of away from license fees, and you were talking about YouTube earlier and streaming, and I was kind of wondering how like short form content feeds into this, because as a younger person, I know a lot of people primarily consume their news through like TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts, for example, and I was just kind of wondering how the BBC, or I guess like ITV, is also addressing that.
Okay, and final question.
Hi, Richard from the Digital TV Group. Incidentally, Claire, an organisation that's slightly older than you. Spoiler alert: I'm not the King's Speech writer. Unfortunately, I'm not funny enough. But if I was on the 13th, I would definitely be putting in the King's Speech that his government would be bringing forward clear proposals to protect the future of TV distribution, universality, public service media, and innovation. I'm also not the drafter of Minister Murray's speech that he's going to give at our summit next week. But my guess is he's going to sit on the fence a little bit about the future of TV distribution, not least because it's the day before the local elections. Question of the panel: how do we ensure that we maintain inertia and we get some real tangible next step actions very, very soon in the next Parliament to make sure that we protect everything that we've discussed this morning?
So did you say how we maintain inertia?
Good point.
Avoid inertia. Right. Very good questions. I'm going to.
Can I quickly jump in on Leo's question?
Hang on, Claire. Just wait. I need to impose some discipline. I will come to all of you, but I'm going to ask a final question. So I'm going to ask each of you to speak. Now, I have heard from a reliable source, this is nothing to do with the Select Committee, that there might be a sort of mini media bill starting in the Lords. Now, I've got no idea if this information is true or not, but my question to each of you to finish off is going to be, I'm Lisa Nandy, and I'm calling you into my office, and I am saying to each of you individually, Keir has just told me that I'm allowed one big policy announcement around DCMS issues. What is your one ask of me, and I will grant it? Okay, you each have one policy ask, which will be in the next Media Bill, if it exists. Right, so that's my final question. I'll do you in order. Claire, just taking each, I'm not going to ask you each of the questions that have been raised. No. You wanted to address Leo's question, I think.
Because it goes to the golden ask. I have myself campaigned for a very long time for there to be exemptions made for the households that I see through the anti-poverty work that I do with Gordon Brown and have done for a decade. And I can only say that I would look for exemptions of all people, who are in below a certain income level, and above all families with children, because those are in 95% of the households we're dealing with, which are in a 4.5 million group of households, which you could classify as poor or desperately poor or destitute, depending on your versions of those. But those households are the ones which result in the most evasion and the most ticking of the box. And I don't think that they should be penalized for their poverty, which is caused by government policies. I cannot believe it. So I think that the group that is most in the papers and the group that is most affected by and would be most affected by an absence of good quality BBC is the group at the bottom of society, and I see them all the time, and I'm very upset that nothing has been done to address the needs of the most poor people
So
in our society.
you would want social exemptions for those people,
Absolutely.
but how would you then make up the deficit of the money?
Treasury would pay for those social exemptions,
Okay, fine.
just like it's going to pay
And-
for the World Service, all of it. That's my dream. My
That's
dream.
that. Okay.
We have 3 years to realize that dream.
That's Claire's policy ask.
Yes,
Just
it's to beat up the Treasury.
one more question for you before I move on to the other two. Just addressing this issue of non-payment by students, some of whom would struggle to afford it, many of whom wouldn't, and it is an issue, and I've seen it amongst the students that I teach. I'm sure those from Leeds. I'm not going to ask you whether you pay for a TV license or not, but it is an issue. How would you address that?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
I think if they're at university, they can afford the license fee. I'm sorry. So yes, I don't understand exactly how they could be technically pursued. I'm no doubt Magnus will tell me that as soon as DTT is switched off, everybody who uses the BBC will be nailed. I don't know.
Okay, Magnus, you want to have a go at that? Talk about distribution, Richard's question, how you get students to pay, but also the question about, are the PSBs doing enough? I think I've got your question right, in terms of how young people...
Short form.
Yeah.
Yes, short form, thank you. Streaming, YouTube, TikTok, etc.
Okay, so distribution first. So the good thing about distribution is the government's going to have to take some decisions in the sense that both the licences, the DTT licences, and indeed the PSB licences, but the DTT licences and the contracts with Arqiva expire in 2030 and 2034. So not taking a decision is taking a decision. And if you don't take a decision, you're going to have to take a decision. You're going to have to roll things on after 2034. So there are a set of decisions that have to be taken. They have to be taken quite soon because you've got to decide: are you going to have a long-term future for DTT, or are you going to transition to IP? You've got to make that decision. And on either basis, there are some trade-offs. There are some difficulties. There are costs that you need to work out who can afford them and who's going to pay for them, and in particular what PSB looks like if you vote to continue DTT forever, because in the end there's just going to be a lot less PSB because the cost of that on the current calculations is very significant. So that's got to happen. It will be painful because it's a big decision. And look, by the way, I'm not minimising the scale of the implications of a switch off of DTT. I think we've been very clear that you're going to need to cater for a probably relatively small, actually, number of people by the time it gets to 2034 who are going to need help, whether that's financial help or digital help to make the transition. But that number is getting smaller all the time as more and more people go online and as demographic change proceeds. So that's the DC one. On short form, I mean, you're dead right. We have a service called The Rundown, which you may or may not know, but it releases on TikTok and Instagram and so on as school finishes. And we get enormous engagement figures from that. It's very short form. You can go through to longer items online and so on. And we get fantastic figures from that. We get no money from it, but we get huge levels of engagement. One thing I'd say on YouTube is that our experience is that whilst you can't put items up from the 6 o'clock news or the 10 o'clock news on just straight onto YouTube and expect people to come in their millions, what we do know is if you re-edit some of those packages and you hook people in early in the first 30 seconds, first minute, they will watch actually quite long pieces on YouTube. I mean, so you'll find people watching for 15 minutes on YouTube. So it's not quite as straightforward as saying if it's online, it's very short form and that's the only way to get people. But what you do need to do is get them early. Get them quickly, and then actually you can pull them in, which is slightly different to the storytelling you might have where someone's made a commitment, if you like to sit down in the evening, watch the 10 o'clock news.
Okay.
And do you want my point on, or are we coming out at the end?
I'm being frantically given the wind-up sign,
Okay.
and I think we must give Iain the last word. So if just that question on switching off DTT, wouldn't that actually solve the whole problem about people avoiding payment?
I don't think it would solve the whole problem, and I think the big thing around this DTT is that we also support a managed transition, but the key thing is about how we don't leave anyone behind, and it's absolutely critical we get to a solution on that. And I think that more generally, that probably speaks to your one policy point. I've sort of talked about intervention, obviously, being a government relations person, I will always say you can have multiple clauses in that one bill, and I would look at that. Frankly, the 5 asks that we set out at RTS as a sort of framework, because they all speak together, really. It's really about, do we want to sustain public service media right now? Now, for the most important thing for the BBC will be the Charter Review and will be the funding, if we can get change on funding settlement, because that will continue to sustain the creative industries in the way that we have. But ultimately right now, and I think to Magnus's point around not making a decision is a decision, ultimately right now we're reaching a number of points of turning where the government need to decide. They need to decide what they want to do. And we think we've set out very reasonable and sensible ways of how to decide on behalf of public service and to protect this very special industry. Things like concessions and others are for the government to decide. There's ways you could build it, and we've got lots of ideas of how you could do that if you wanted to, but ultimately it will come down to an active decision by government. I think that's why I called you up on the inertia point, that our enemy here is not a particular set of ministers or that. Our enemy is status quo. Our enemy is inertia, and so I think we all need to come together and say now is the time. Let's all let's come and let's intervene, whether it's through one bill with multiple clauses or a series of measures and regulatory interventions. I think.
So what's your one policy ask? You don't have one.
I've got those 5 asks.
What was your one policy ask?
I'd give DCMS ministers a lot more discretion to bring forward secondary legislation around many of these issues.
All right, my vote goes to Claire, I'm afraid. She's the only one who had a full coherent policy ask.
Policy ask is not a legislation. It would be a funding centre.
Okay. All right, they're diplomats. Can you please thank our panel for a great session?